Okay, so I'm here to talk to you, as we've just heard, about web components. I should start perhaps with what I rehearsed yesterday, which is, and you'll have to pardon me in advance, buongiorno, sono molto felice di essere qui a Bologna. Questo è tutto quello che ho imparato. Thank you. Thank you. Just wanted to give the translators a little rest as well. They're very hard at work. I've given quite a few talks about web components in the last few years. And I've realized recently that I didn't really understand them. I was kind of obsessed with the technology being new and not really thinking about what they're good for. It was all about the shiny. I kind of started to get it this year, I think. I wrote an article for Smashing magazine. This is a detailed introduction to custom elements, which was variously described by commenters as demeaning, condescending, and a bit silly. So that's let you know that you're talking to an expert here, so I can really give you the detailed information. I'm going to talk about context. I'm going to talk about why web components are, where they came from, what they're for. Context is really important, and I'm going to start with a little story about context. I went to see, a few years ago, an artist at the Tate Gallery in London, a Brazilian artist called Helio Oiticica. And one of his works was just a white canvas. It wasn't a blank canvas, he'd painted it white. And you look at that white canvas and you think, oh, modern art, so boring, so controversial, blah, blah, blah. But what you realize is that that white canvas marked for him a beginning of an exploration of color. Then he started painting canvases other colors, and then mixing colors, and then building bigger things with colors, until eventually you ended up with these kind of huge, room-sized, vibrant pieces. And it was only seeing it all together and understanding that added the context to that white canvas. Alone, it signifies nothing, but in the context of what he was trying to explore, it was super important. So that's what I'm going to try and give you about web components today. What are they? The literal explanation is they are the component model for the web. That's slightly boring. Perhaps you could best say they're a suite of technologies for making reusable UI controls or services. Maybe a little bit more understandable, but still quite boring. I prefer to think of them as just a fundamental change to the way we build for the web. A complete shift in the balance of power. They give the control over what we build to us, out of the hands of the browser vendors and the W3C and the WG, and they give the power and the responsibility that comes with it, that goes to us. Say you have this fairly common image carousel. And up here you have the images, previous and next buttons, showing where you are, and a button to launch in a separate window. At the moment, we do that with HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It probably looks something like this, just the markup for it. But that's kind of fragile, because if you want to take this component, if you want to take this image carousel and put it onto another website, you have to copy all of the code that comes with it, and you have to copy include the calls to external JavaScript files and so on, and you have to paste it all into your page. And because of the way CSS works with specificity, you could easily end up with CSS rules or overwriting what you've done, conflicting with what you've done. JavaScript, if it's not carefully written, if you're just dropping it in from somewhere else, could easily affect what you've done here. It's also kind of messy to have all this code everywhere. And it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a bunch of divs and classes and lists and stuff. And what web components set out to do are to make something like this more meaningful, to hide the complexity, and to make it shareable and reusable. So you could easily just take your image carousel, and instead of a whole bunch of markup, turn it into one single element, one single shareable element. You could do even better than that, and take each of the individual pieces and turn those into elements as well. perhaps you don't want to only use your previous and next buttons here. You might want to also use them on a page of paginated search results. So everything becomes a little shareable block, a little shareable component or module. It's like kind of the difference is, if this were just a toy you bought, it would be quite cool, but it would do one thing. You would only be able to use it as an Indiana Jones playset. But because it's Lego, you can break that down into multiple pieces and build your own stuff and take the components and use them elsewhere. That's kind of what we're looking at with web components. Continuing the Indiana Jones theme because of where we are and what's going on, I'm going to try and explain each of the core parts of web components and compare them to an Indiana Jones film. I'm going to beat this metaphor to death, so I apologize in advance. Custom elements, they like set the scene for everything that's going to follow. They introduce the main characters. They're the core component. They've got to be Raiders of the Lost Ark. And like the Ark, they're extremely powerful, but very, very dangerous if used for wrong. Shadow DOM, even just because of the name, and because it's the most complex, and some people love it and some people hate it, it's got to be Temple of Doom. HTML imports, they're not revolutionary. They're a kind of a crowd pleaser. They're the least sexy of the series, but they're kind of universal and accessible. Last Crusade. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. There is nothing in web components as bad as Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I'm not going to make that comparison. That's totally unfair. There's also what's called templates. They're not kind of part of the core web components, as it were, but they're sort of an extra. They expand the canon. They add an extra dimension. So they're going to be the young Indiana Jones Chronicles. And with that, I apologize. Let's put this metaphor to sleep. It's served its purpose. No more torturous metaphors like that. Why do we have web components? It all goes back to this, one of the most incredible, simple, and yet revolutionary things that we've had ever on the web, view page source. I don't know about you, I'm guessing that the majority of you, like me, have learned an awful lot by using this option, by looking at what other people have done, by just being able to inspect what other people have done, and in the early days, don't like to admit to this too much now, in the early days, just ripping off what people had done and putting it into my own websites. And if this weren't there, we couldn't do that. So it's genuinely revolutionary. And there's a need. This shows that there's a need for us to want to look at other people's code and to share it. And this has kind of continued through many years and many iterations. We used to have Java applets. If you're around long enough, you'll remember that at one point it was almost mandatory for you to put like a photograph of a house on a lake and have the lake underneath it rippling. That was all done with Java applets. And Dynamic Drive, which was the place we went to get animated cursors so that the stars would follow our cursor around the screen. If you're young and you don't remember, it was crazy. It was like the 60s. Everybody was on drugs. It was nuts. Thanks. Today we have things like object-oriented CSS and BEM, and these are ways, again, to kind of have that control to use CSS naming conventions in a way that gives us namespaces and makes that reuse of code a lot easier. We've got things like jQuery UI and Bootstrap, which we've already talked about, these libraries of components. And we've got things like React and Ember, these client-side layout engines which build components for us. They're all kind of looking at doing the same job. They're all kind of looking at reusability, shareability. And this is what web components have been built to address, to kind of fill that need sort of officially. So I'm going to take a quick look at how kind of standards are made today. And of course, the two main kind of bodies we have are the W3C and the WhatWG. They've both got their advantages and disadvantages. Now, the W3C obviously is quite a slow process to make something into a recommendation, into a standard. because they have to pass through this kind of very high level of kind of accessibility testing, usability testing, building test suites to make sure things work. So it's good, but slow. And the web today is moving very quickly, and it's almost seen as too slow for some people. They're also quite ideological, and they end up with things like XHTML2, about which the less said, the better. Excuse me. On the other side, we have the WhatWG, who are responsible for HTML5. They move faster, but it's kind of a very dictatorial process. We have Hixie, who says what gets in, what gets out. And it means that when we have the community making stuff, like we've talked about the picture element, I know Estelle mentioned it first, a few other people have touched on it, and the main element, we've had to really fight to get those in, because there was just Hixie kind of went not interested at first and had to come back with strong use cases and data. But the two of them kind of don't trust each other that much. There's a bit of a conflict between the two as well about who gets to do what. I don't want to go into the ins and outs of it, but it's kind of like there's no trust. It's sort of like you throw me the idol and I'll throw you the whip. It's sort of this kind of situation going on between the W3C and the WhatWG. Then there's browser vendors. And the browser vendors, again, they can implement stuff really quickly. They don't have to, if they think there's a need for something, they just put it in. The problems we've had in the past were some browser vendors not kind of documenting sufficiently, which meant the other browser vendors had to kind of reverse engineer what they were doing. This is the case with kind of, off the top of my head, transitions and animations, which Apple introduced in Safari, which they semi-documented, but it ended up kind of not being the best it could be. But everybody had to kind of rush to sort of catch up with what they'd done. And they've all got ulterior motives in what they want to do. I'm not going to talk negatively about Mozilla because, here we are, and I know which side my bread's buttered on. So Mozilla are fantastic. You won't hear a bad word against them from me. Google want to keep the web open, but they want to sell you ads at the same time. Internet Explorer want to do the best for Windows users. Safari want to do the best for Apple users. They're all they've got their own little biases and things they want to do. So it's not always as straightforward and maybe as fast as we want it to be. But then there's us, the developers, the community as such. In the past, we've created tools like jQuery, like Modernizer, like Sass, that have bought things that we need. We've identified these needs, and we've built the tools that we want to make these things possible. And through these, we've come up with new standards that have been adopted into the main languages, query selector and query selector rule, and class list from jQuery, the supports rule from Modernizer, the Sass, the picture element, the main element, there's all kind of things. So we make stuff as well. But we have to kind of make things and then wait for other people to kind of optimize it, to kind of adopt it natively. And so recently we've had this thing called the Extensible Web Manifesto, this hashtag extend the web forward, which is a movement to expose low-level capabilities of the browser, allowing authors like us to replicate the things that can be done in HTML and CSS, to kind of stop making browser engines such of a mystery, allow us to develop and test first in JavaScript, and then base new standards on community-created features, like we saw on the previous slide, but allow us to do it faster and with more power. It's quite possible that whatever the next version of HTML5 is, whether it's HTML6 or HTML, the living standard, whatever it becomes called, it's quite possible that a lot of that is going to be made of the things that we build using the power of web components. We'll get to dictate the future of the tools we use, which is incredibly, incredibly liberating idea. So let me talk you through again each of the main components of the web component suite, kind of show you why we want them. Go back to my carousel example here. One of the things that custom elements allows us to do, as I said earlier, is to kind of give meaning to the things we build, not to have this spaghetti, bowl of spaghetti. You guys know what spaghetti is, right? Yeah. To have this kind of bowl of spaghetti of divs and lists and all this kind of stuff, but to give kind of meaning back. So why not, if we have a carousel that we use all the time, why not call it, for example, flex carousel, because it's flexible. And if we have these previous next buttons, why not create an element called previous next, or open lightbox, or show position? Let's create elements that we can reuse all the time and name them after the functions they perform. This is actually not that new an idea. One of the first browsers to implement this, you may be shocked to know, is Internet Explorer 5. Long, long time ago, they had these things called HTML components, which did more or less the same job. But Microsoft being Microsoft, they were extremely proprietary and not kind of open as standards, so they never got adopted. But it was an attempt to do the same thing that we're doing today. Shadow DOM I can best explain using these buttons that you see all over the place, that are potentially not useful and possibly even harmful, but people love them anyway. Inside each of these buttons, there's a ton of markup. This is what it looks like inside the +1 button. It's just full of markup. There's loads of it. But because there's so much, and because of this problem of fragility that we talked about earlier, they don't want these elements just dropped into the page, so we include them as iframes. And iframes, that's an attempt for what we want to call encapsulation. We want to contain these things and not have them accessible to the rest of the page, to kind of make them more robust. So iframes, are good for some things, but they're not good for others, and they're kind of heavy on the DOM. And so we want a better way to do that. So that's what the shadow DOM is for hiding the complexity, encapsulating. And HTML imports, well, they're quite easy. They're a way to share things. So we could have our previous next element and share it across multiple pages on the same website, or even share it across multiple websites. So we have meaningful naming, modularization, encapsulation, sharing. Those are the reasons we have web components. How do we make them? Thank you. How do we make them? So for this bit, I've got to show some code, I'm afraid. I was trying to do this without code, but talking about web components without showing code is extremely difficult. So we'll start with custom elements. It's going to get very technical, so excuse me. Custom elements. First of all, you tell the browser you want to create an element called Indiana Jones, and then you use it. That's it. You say to the browser, I want to do this, I'm going to create an element called this, and then you put it, and then when it sees the element, it goes, oh yeah, that's the thing it told me about earlier. Okay, that's cool, carry on. But of course, just doing that, just making an element like that doesn't really give it any power. It just lets the browser know it exists. So what we can do is kind of extend it to add properties and methods to it. So we can say, OK, I want to create a new prototype for it based on a standard HTML element prototype. And to that, I'm going to add a method called whip. And then when you register that, you say, register this element with this name and use this prototype. So it's like a standard element, but it's also got this new method called whip. And then in your document, you can find it in the DOM as usual and just call that method. So you've created basically a very, very simple API for that element. And you can extend that way, way more than I've done. You can create a totally custom API for each element that you include, which is very nice. If you don't want to create a brand new element, you can just say, OK, I want this button to be an Indiana Jones element. So I've taken this button and I said, this button is Indiana Jones. And again, I create my prototype, only this time I'm using a button element prototype. And I've given it the same function. Then I'm registering it using the prototype. And I'm saying this extends the button element. This is fantastic for kind of this transitional phase, this backwards compatibility, because if the browser doesn't support custom elements or JavaScript breaks or whatever happens, it just falls back to being a button. But where that is present, it becomes a button with extra powers. So that's custom elements. For Shadow DOM, it's best to show by example. Here's the video element, which, as we all know, is basically created by doing something like that. We give it a source, we give it a few controls, whatever, we have it. But then for us, it creates all of this extra UI. The play button, the progress bar, all of this stuff is created for us. It's kind of magical. So if we look inside, if we were allowed to look inside this button, this video element, we'd actually see there's a whole bunch of markup in there. My laser, yeah. So all of this stuff is inside the video element, which creates our controls. But it's hidden from us by this thing called the shadow root. That shadow root is the shadow DOM. This DOM that you're seeing inside here is hidden from the main DOM. And it's encapsulated as well. So we can't style these or control them with JavaScript unless by explicit invitation from the element. To create a shadow DOM, you use the create shadow root method, and then you put whatever HTML you like inside there. And again, that's it. At its most basic, that's as simple as it gets. We create a new shadow root, we put stuff inside it, and all that stuff in there is hidden from the DOM. We can't access it unless by explicit invitation. And that means we can take our custom element and we can just drop it into another page and not have to worry about all that stuff that's inside it. You can kind of extend this idea. You can put other markup inside the custom element as well, using the template element. The template element just means anything that's inside here, don't render it when the DOM is being rendered. Just ignore it for now, and then when I want it, I'll use JavaScript to access it and use it. Did you get my joke here, by the way? Indiana Jones and the Template of Doom? Okay. Thank you, thank you. It's the hardest bit of writing these slides was coming up with that joke. HTML imports, again, super simple. They just sit in the head of your document like CSS or JavaScript. You say this is an import type. The relation is it's an import, and use this HTML. And then you just have a little snippet of HTML, and that gets included in your page. This is a really cool little mapping library I use sometimes called Leaflet Maps. And it's very nice, but the setup for it is to first include the CSS file in the head of your document, then include the JavaScript file, then put a div element in the page, then give it dimensions, then you have to activate it with JavaScript. In the future, I can imagine sites like Leaflet offering us two things: an HTML file to import and a custom element. And just by using that, we'll be able to get a map up and running. You can see some of these already. People have done it for Google Maps, all kinds of stuff. You just drop that custom element and that import in your page, and they work. Where that element is will be replaced by a map with the attributes you set it. So again, that's all the code I've got. I know there's a little bit more. That's most of the code I've got. And apologies for showing it. I didn't really want to. But I wanted to demonstrate how stupidly easy it is to kind of get this stuff up and running. Very, very basically, of course. There's all kinds of more you can do with it. But at its most basic, it's very, very simple. Now, that simplicity is kind of a blessing and a curse, because I think what we'll end up with is when we give people the power to make stuff, we end up with the genuine following problem, where we have a small amount of stuff that's useful and well-made. We have a slightly larger amount of stuff that's useful, and then we have everything else. This is what's basically following Sturgeon's law. In case you haven't heard of Sturgeon's law says 90% of everything is crap. And this goes for like everything we've got today on the web. JavaScript libraries, CSS frameworks. There's a lot of crap out there. There's a lot of stuff we don't need. And then there's a few things which are really, really, really good. So giving us the power to make our own elements is a great responsibility. And we have to kind of use it wisely. This is what Sally's talk yesterday was kind of all about. We have this new power coming with web components, but we have to take that responsibility seriously. We have to do it because Spider-Man tells us we have to do it. So we have to think about things like accessibility, compatibility, backwards compatibility. We have to think about usability. There's all kinds of stuff. Giving us the power to do things means we have to have the responsibility to do things well. The W3C process was very good at doing this. Something wouldn't become a recommendation until all of that had been figured out and tested. And Web Components makes us the people responsible for doing that. It's like your parents giving you responsibility. We're going on holiday and we're leaving you alone for the first time, so make sure you don't get up to any naughty business while we're gone. And at first we're going to have parties and we're going to trash the place, but after a while, we have to kind of look after it so they don't find out. So there's this thing, Adi Osmani came up with this kind of, I don't know what you call this, approach, set of rules called FIRST. You should make your web components focused, independent, reusable, small, and testable. Make sure that you do those 5 simple things with your web components as a very, very basic, and then offer it out to the community. This is what, again, Sally's talked about this, and Jeremy talked about this yesterday with this kind of points of failure. Don't make your web component that you make a point of failure. Make it play nicely with everything else. Don't use tech for tech's sake. Think that you've got a point for this thing existing and it actually does something. Adi's first was kind of continued by Steve Faulkner at the Paciello group, who's come up with this, what's he called, a punch list. So if you're building web components, custom elements, make sure that they pass all of these tests. Focused, operable, expected operation, everything. All the links will be in my slides when you look at it, but when you're making these, always bear these things in mind, that it has to play nicely. You've got the power, don't abuse it. And I think we're going to end up with, again, to quote Jeremy, this idea of a web of trust. This is a blog post he wrote recently. We're going to end up with kind of this community-led thing where we kind of, we promote the good stuff and we kind of downplay the bad stuff. We have to. Now we've been given that power. I think it was in Andre's talk yesterday, again, he talked about other industries having trusted advisors. We have to be those trusted advisors. There's a few websites already, like Component Kitchen and CustomElements.io, which are already kind of allowing us to upvote good stuff and downvote bad stuff. So get involved with those things. The problem is, if we think back to Indiana Jones again, all of the bad guys from every Indiana Jones film, they were all corrupted by wanting power and abusing it. We have Arnold Todt, Mola Ram, Elsa Schneider, George Lucas, all of the... all of those people were given too much power, and they tried to use it for evil. And they all came to a very sticky end. This is what happens when you try to use good powers for evil. There's a few things that web components haven't quite figured out yet. I'm not pretending it's some kind of Shangri-La where everything's fantastic. There's a few problems with it. One of them is that if your custom element makes references to other libraries, say you want to include jQuery in yours, and then someone else builds a custom element and they include jQuery in theirs, or even a reset style sheet, what's going to happen is, even though the files might be identical, if the paths to the files are different, it's going to download them both. The only way it'll download, it will cache a copy of each one. So if it finds another one with the identical path and the identical file name, it will skip that and use the one it's already got cached. But if you use a lot of external libraries in your custom elements, this is, at the moment, a problem that there's not a great solution for yet. Hopefully there will be. And if you're using other people's custom elements, consider this as well. The other thing is that each HTML import currently blocks rendering as it finds it. So as the browser comes to an import file, it will stop rendering to download this and then carry on. So if you're using a lot of import files, there's going to be a lot of blocked rendering on the page. You can get around this by perhaps concatenating all the imports you use first and just doing one big import file. There are ideas, there's discussion about making this asynchronous. But at the moment, as things stand, this is a problem. When can you start using them? As of now, support looks sort of like this. Chrome, and so by extension Opera, have implemented everything. You can play with all this stuff in, all unflagged. You can implement this stuff and play around with it in Chrome and Opera to your heart's content. No problems whatsoever. Whoops, beg your pardon. Firefox have implemented custom elements, Shadow DOM, and HTML imports. I believe at the moment they're all behind a flag while they're being tested. Do you know if that's correct, Christian? That's correct. So all of those elements, that's all implemented, so you can get your copy of Firefox. I think it's in the like certainly in beta. I'm not sure about release. Ask Christian about it later. But you can flag those on and play with those and test them yourselves. And the template element is fully implemented and has been for a while. Safari 8 that just came out 2 days ago or whenever, that has support for the template element. You can start using that right now. The rest of the stuff, who knows? Apple is Apple, you know. You might as well try and get blood out of a stone. But they are involved kind of behind the scenes. The WebKit developers are involved in the discussion about web components and have shown interest in doing them. Internet Explorer lists everything at the moment as under consideration. They're thinking about it. It's not an active development, but it's probably going to happen. There's a good website called Are We Componentized Yet? Which will give you the kind of the full breakdowns. If you're really interested, kind of follow those. But if you want to use them, you can kind of play around with them and use them right now. It actually might be a little surprising to you that a site I'd imagine most of you use every day, or at least have connection with every day, is already using them. On github.com, these things here where they tell you the relative time to when you made your commits. If you have a look at that code, they're extending the time element. So they're already using this custom element to create this relative time for you. And you know, that's a big site. That's, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of visits a day, but they've already started using custom elements, albeit in a very kind of small, low-key way, but it's there. And if you want to play around with them again, kind of cross-browser, experimenting with what can be done, there's a few different libraries out there built on web components, or the notion of web components. We have Polymer, which is driven by the Chrome team, but open to anyone. We have Xtags, which is Mozilla's kind of the driving force behind that one, but again, they're public libraries. Polymer is kind of covers all of web components, and Xtags is largely focused on custom elements, but does allow you to extend them with kind of Shadow DOM and so on. And there's this one called Bosonic, which is a community-led one, which uses the exact web components, properties and features, etc. Each of them has got kind of a component library built on top of that, of their own UI elements. So Polymer Core, we've got Polymer elements. Xtag has a thing called Brick, and Bosonic has Bosonic elements. So they're kind of a pre-built component library built on top of each of the libraries. And then if you're looking at really, really new kind of Android or Google's material design, whatever it's called, material design, they have this thing called paper elements. The best thing, really the best thing about all these three libraries from different backgrounds, etc., with different teams of developers, is that they're all built on a common set of polyfills. This thing called Platform JS. That's totally open to every community, and all of the different web components people all kind of contribute to this. So there's this really stable set of polyfills, which is kind of being built on and extended all the time. And everybody's collaborating on it. This is not kind of a browser versus browser or anything like that. There's no kind of politics involved in this. Everybody's using the same polyfill library, which is amazing. So I've kind of come to the end of my talk, so I need to probably sum up everything that I've shown you. Rather than kind of listing it all out, I've tried to kind of get it into a little pithy little statement. So web components are for you to drive the future of the web. So I'd ask that you please drive responsibly. And that's the end. Thank you very much.